This time around, I think once Christina has finished speaking and we finish the Q&A session, we might try to do a little approximation of what we used to do in the P2P in-person meetings and just go around the group and, 1 minute or 2 minutes on what you're doing now and, what might be of interest to the group. We haven't really convened that way basically since lockdown. And so I'm assuming in that period, we've all been doing good stuff, and we can share it with each other at the end of the meeting, and then we'll have some announcements about what's coming up and some other ideas. And so I think with that, I'd like to turn the introductory session of this over to Susan, and maybe you can introduce Christina, and then Christina, we can start your presentation.
Thanks, Dean. So I have the pleasure of introducing Christina Bollo, AIA and PhD, who is an assistant professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Illinois. She teaches design and applied theory courses focused on health and well-being in the built environment. Her research investigates the role of housing policy in shaping housing design and the role of housing design in the health and well-being of residents. Her research and teaching is informed by her previous work designing affordable housing for nonprofit clients in Oakland and Seattle. She was the winner of the 2020 AIA Housing and Community Development Knowledge Community Architectural Impact Research Grant, which she utilized to gather and analyze some of the data that she will be presenting today in her program called Integrating Green and Social in Successful Housing. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm going to start my slides and talk about a little bit some of the synergy with this opportunity today to speak to all of you about the integration of green and social. Let me make sure I can share. Here we go. Okay, everyone can see slides?
Yes, thank you, Christina.
Excellent. So thank you, Susan. Thank you for all of you for being here today. I'm really excited to speak to you about this research that I did on the culture of evaluation in our profession. And I don't always put all these little acronyms and everything after my name when I give a talk, but for this in particular, I wanted to connect some of my history to the talk today. So out of architecture school, I used a fairly early LEED certification to design, or accreditation rather, to design certified affordable housing, in particular in Seattle. And I then focused after about 10 years in practice on a sustainable architecture PhD from the University of Oregon. And then as a researcher at University of British Columbia, I found that Passive House, SPIAS in particular, would be really useful to our work on housing research in Vancouver as they rolled out a requirement for Passive House for all future development. So these things really feed into my history as a green designer, as a green architect, but also incorporating the social side that's so important for affordable housing. So again, this was funded and instigated by AIA Housing and Community Development Knowledge Community. And I'm grateful not just for the funding which enabled this research to take place, enabled me to work with a graduate student, Yue Shi, on this presentation, but it also gave me a community to work on this project. We don't always connect very well between the academy and the profession, and being able to work with people on AIH, I'm always getting the acronyms all mixed up, AIHCBKC was a really great opportunity for me professionally. So today's presentation, I have 4 parts. First, I'll present the results of my interviews and survey and explain what I learned about the current state of housing evaluation. Next, I've created evaluator archetypes, which are simplified versions of housing architects who are thinking about and conducting evaluations. And then finally, I have some policy and program suggestions for how we as a community of professionals can create a culture of social evaluation in housing that can start to catch up with a culture of green building evaluation. And then one of the things I'm most excited about today is the fact that we're all on Zoom together, and that creates a culture of discussion and sharing. So I'm looking forward to the end of the presentation as well, where I can learn more about your work and we can discuss some of these issues together. There are 4 learning objectives, and I would kind of simplify them to say identifying the barriers to POE and the means to mitigate those barriers, to see the value of social evaluation as a feed forward tool, and I'll talk about that in a few slides, to consider the win-win possibility of teaming up with an academic to evaluate your buildings, and finally to integrate social metrics with green metrics for holistic performance. I really love this quote from Gary Raw. It captures the inherent difficulty of social evaluation in buildings. So just as energy use was once in the wheelhouse of mechanical and electrical engineers and operations and maintenance departments, we often leave the social success of our buildings to our clients. In this research, I really set out to learn what methods housing architects who do measure the social side of their projects use, and then what architects who don't measure need so that they can measure the social side. And in the following slides, I'll present the results from the questionnaire and the interviews and give you a little bit of what I've learned. So on topics of evaluation in the questionnaire, I queried both the environmental and social methods and was most curious about those that fit in both categories. So on the right are the metrics mentioned during the interviews, and on the left are those mentioned in the questionnaire. When I asked what metrics people had used or explored in their evaluations, over 2/3 of the respondents chose resident and staff satisfaction and unit energy use. So those were quite common actually in the questionnaire. About half of the respondents had measured sound transmission, which surprised me. It's a huge issue in housing design, of course, but I didn't know that people were actually looking at that in a post-occupancy setting. And then less than 1/3 cited health outcomes or vacancy or odor. After the interviews, I learned that the stages of evaluation were not always clear to people. So one interviewee told me that despite collecting data through surveys and interviews for multiple buildings, they had never analyzed it because they just had no capacity. So I queried the questionnaire respondents after conducting interviews on this process, and 75% reported collecting data, but only 1 person responded they had analyzed the data, and only 1 said they had reported what they learned, either internally or externally. And interestingly, those weren't the same questionnaire. So there was a real gap between collecting data about buildings, understanding that data through analysis methods, and then reporting back out, either in a lunch and learn setting internally or even in a report to a client. So with this knowledge and these results and the analysis of the interviews, I developed a framework for what I call a good enough evaluation. I think sometimes the stages of like the Wolfgang Preiser stages of post-occupancy evaluation are intimidating to people, and it can be I mean, it's a great structure if a firm has time and budget, but it can also be intimidating and make people think, well, if I can't do it all the way, I shouldn't try, or I shouldn't do it. And so I was interested in this simple, done, reported idea. So the idea is to keep the scope small and manageable and have a plan in advance for analysis and a plan for reporting in advance, so that there's a research plan, kind of a design of the research on an existing building. And I think a good enough evaluation is modest. It doesn't need to have a full-blown survey, for example, but it asks an answerable question about the building and how it's being used, and the results are shared with others. And I think those 3 parts are essential to conducting a good enough evaluation. And I really can't overemphasize the done aspect. In my analysis, this seemed to be the difference between people who had embraced evaluation in their practice and made it a consistent part, and those for whom it was just an occasional exercise. The interviews really revealed incredible innovative methods for evaluation. So Katie Ackerley at David Baker Architects introduced me to what they called at the time a structured site walk process. during which they visit with a prospective client the DBA's buildings or those of the client as part of the pre-design process for an upcoming project. Together, they evaluate the program and functions, environmental quality, and systems. And then they compile the data in a very simple matrix for comparison. They report out the observations using a slide deck template, or if the client requests a more formal report or presentation. James Conlon from SAHA in Oakland described for me their 3-part resident engagement process for understanding their needs. First, the residents are asked to prioritize their 5 most important common area amenities. So example, resident parking, visitor parking, laundry, etc. Next, the residents are shown big poster-sized pictures of actual amenities in their building. And then they put colored stickers, the residents put colored stickers on each, and then answer the question, how often do you use this space? With the answer, some, always, sometimes, or never. And we can, just in the method itself, even it's a kind of a transformative process because the residents themselves see how the overall collective of the building is using the space. And that then guided discussion that followed in the 3rd part of the workshop. I think that the most important thing that I learned, and maybe this is like a Pechakucha or something, 1 slide type presentation, but the most important innovation I heard about from many of the advocates for evaluation, architects who are already using evaluation in their practice, was the importance of it being feed forward and not feedback. And not all of them used that exact term. That was something that was really, we started to discuss as an idea during the interview. Some people would say to me, well, it's better to do it at the beginning than the end. And there was that kind of sentiment. And it really seemed like this idea of feed forward was enabled the architect to plan for how it fit into the project scope. For example, DBA's site walk or Saha's resident engagement process, they did this in order to inform the next project, not to shine a spotlight on the previous project. So feed forward really allows the effort to match the fee structure. Many of the questionnaire respondents noted that there was no fee left for evaluation at the end of the project, and that was a barrier for them. Feed forward also captures the excitement and energy of a new project, which alleviates the pain of seeing a building not work quite as we had hoped, but instead use those lessons to inform the next. And then very importantly for housing, feed forward eliminates the danger of overpromising building changes to residents. So in affordable housing, when we ask residents for their input, it's very important to say you are influencing the next project. We're not looking to change things that are here, but instead you're part of our process of designing the next building well. And so people then are empowered to contribute to the next building instead of just bringing up negative things for the sake of change in the existing building. So while feed forward, I see it as a philosophical shift in the culture of evaluation. There are a lot of other smaller and more pragmatic changes that practitioners can make to enhance evaluation that I learned through the interviews and questionnaire. So in the next part of the presentation, I'd like to introduce you to the housing evaluation archetypes. This approach borrows from the marketing world. It's often called psychobehavioral or psychographic segmentation. You may have seen a New York Times feature on this around vaccine uptake recently. It's a way to not focus on demographics or to pigeonhole groups of people, but rather to see behavior and motivation as one of the factors in people's decision-making. So I created these composite characters to really help understand the barriers to evaluation that different people face, but also to suggest very targeted ways to mitigate those barriers. So there are 4 archetypes from this analysis: the expert, the very green, the so casual, and what we call not yet but soon. The motivations and strengths are unique to each of these archetypes, and the are unique as well. The final slide of each archetype in the following section will suggest next steps for that archetype so that they can create this culture of evaluation. I'm going to walk through each of the archetypes on the next several slides, and you might recognize people you know. You might also recognize yourself, and it's a way to connect people who want to make some of these changes to doing it in a way that's appropriate for the specific issues that they faced. So the first is the expert. I would say the expert is motivated by learning. They want to understand how well the building works for the residents and for the staff. They have a strong drive to improve future buildings and to understand how design decisions and intent play out in an occupied building. They want to cultivate repeat clients and are very motivated by that. One quote that exemplifies the expert's motivation is from a questionnaire response to quote, I asked the question, why do you evaluate the building? And this questionnaire response said, to build a case for advocating for or against certain design decisions on future projects. So again, keeping with that feed forward theme, the idea of moving toward the next rather than finding fault with the previous. The experts are unafraid of seeking access to buildings after they are completed, and they are very organized about the times and structures of visits. They develop surveys and observation instruments in-house often, and they are interested in the social and environmental quality of the space and the intersections between those two realms. Experts often visit several buildings at a time. And in the best circumstances, they compare the data from multiple buildings because this is one of the simplest forms of analysis. A very complete evaluation can also stand alone as a case study. One thing to watch out for, I would say for experts, if there are experts in the audience today, is that the analysis of the data and the reporting back to the client can get kind of conflated. And that's one thing that experts brought up with me as I was doing the interviews. So there can be times when the analysis becomes the report, and the report isn't seen as a separate part of the evaluation process. The expert archetype was the only one who noted attending conferences to report on the building's evaluation. And I would say the next steps for the experts in terms of mitigating barriers is to share their results with other architects, not just with their clients. This archetype is confident and rigorous enough to share their results with others, and exporting their product, but also their process can teach others to effectively evaluate. And one of the people who I've forged a relationship with around this research, Katie Ackerley from DBA, is very committed to this idea of sharing the process of what they do in that firm in terms of evaluation to mitigate barriers for other people who are interested in evaluation but don't necessarily have the structure up yet. So the very green archetype is the housing architect who regularly evaluates their projects, but their motivation is more energy and water efficiency and less the social goals. They want to understand how well the building and systems are conserving energy, to understand what's gone wrong, and to conform to expectations from LEED, Living Building Challenge, and other green building programs. The very green archetype has full presumptive access to their buildings. It's usually an assumption of doing a program like LEED that you'll be able to get in later. And so access is not an issue for this group. My guess is the very green archetype is well represented in this room. And of course, all of us have little bits of each of these. And so it can depend on the project or depend on the setting. The very green evaluator collects data through commissioning of systems, analysis of energy bills, observations of thermal bridging. They understand the data. They understand the data very well. It's definitely an area where very green archetype excels. And this is in part because they are comparing how well their building is performing as compared to a baseline, compared to an energy model. So the analysis process is kind of baked in already. So the very green archetype reports back to clients through written summary documents. There's often a template for this. They occasionally attend conferences, and sometimes, depending on where they live and work, they may have a structure to share results with a greater community of architects. The next step for the very green evaluators is to understand resident behavior and energy use. This could include electricity bills, interviews, surveys, log of activities. I think of this as triangulating the data between behavior and use and more quantitative aspects, such as like watching the meter run. They need to mitigate the barrier of fee, since this might be seen as scope creep unless the client is on board. And I would say this archetype is less likely to have a relationship with social services in the building or property management, but more likely to know the maintenance staff. And I think property management could be a middle actor between the maintenance and social service. So the so casual archetype is the housing architect driven by curiosity, who is essentially conducting a level 1 post-occupancy evaluation. But they would never call it a POE. They often tag along on visits to the building, plan for other reasons, and they're very interested, in how the building is being used. The so casual is really driven by curiosity. They tend to look at one building at a time in isolation, so the analysis level is lower than if there were a comparison. For the so casual archetype, they view what they are doing as the only option. So a quote from a questionnaire captures this. Quote, formal POEs mainly don't occur because of lack of access and liability concern, often from the owner. This has been the case when we have raised it with both for-profit and nonprofit developers. The so casual archetype loves to report internally, even organizing lunch and learns in-house. They tend to be strong mentors and share their results with coworkers. Analyzing this data that they kind of surreptitiously collect, I would say, is the obvious next step for the so casual. Once they do that, I also suggest that they take their enthusiasm to slightly more formal in-person gatherings, especially with less experienced housing architects who they can mentor and inspire. So none of my interviewees fit this next archetype, but there were many questionnaire respondents who said, not yet, but soon, when asked about evaluation. I was really intrigued by this group because while they self-selected to answer a questionnaire about housing evaluation, most of their responses were purely aspirational. The quote that exemplifies this group is, we're heading in this direction as a firm, but don't yet have a system in place. And a barrier to collecting data for this group is the inability to visit the building after it's complete. If they can't visit, it is even less likely that they can survey their residents or look at something like unit energy bills. A way to mitigate the barriers to feed forward with repeat clients and to visit the previous building while getting ready to design the next. This would make the evaluation process more collaborative and less fault finding. The not yet but soon archetype measures their success through awards and repeat clients. They may even ask their clients to evaluate their professional performance, but not the building's performance. While not yet but soon does not have their own results to report in or out, they are voracious consumers of other people's building evaluations, which may be why they answered my questionnaire. They report watching webinars at a much greater rate than others. And again, methodologically, this might be a clue as to why they're interested in the topic. Like there's an aspiration here to get started. So I see this as very fertile ground to kind of support the next generation of evaluators. The next steps for this archetype are to overcome some of these barriers, such as time and access. And I also think they will benefit from this idea of simple, done, reported as part of the feed forward process. In some ways, I think they just need a boost. Like I think there's a program that can be created that gives people a very simple template, people who are interested but don't have the structure, so they can do these first evaluations and see how much it can inform the work of the firm. So the most important next step generally isn't just mitigating these barriers to housing design evaluation, but to create the culture of evaluation that permeates our work. So in this final section, I will suggest some small ways we can work together toward that goal. To move evaluation forward, there's some strategies for every archetype, which I'll share now. So no matter where people are on the evaluation journey, there are small things that can be done. And I will say that some of these are carrots or incentives, but some are sticks. or regulations. I do think the most vital strategies are those that create scaffolding, really, to shift us as a profession toward evaluation. Several of the interviewees suggested that we treat social metrics like we do green metrics. One asks, not rhetorically, what's the blower door for social? So what's the thing we can do that we can compare all buildings, right? And there's a set point, right, of how much infiltration is acceptable. What's the set point of social in our buildings? So we could work to require that LIHTC qualified allocation plans include some requirements or points for evaluation. Ray Demers, one of my interviewees, suggested that the required evaluation for submission to LIHTC could be a previously built building evaluation, so that the future project could learn from that and it would be intrinsic to the application. This could also be done through incentives or marginally increased funding through syndicators such as Enterprise, and it could mimic the early days of green design in affordable housing. There could be a policy lever that could shift the culture, even a B-series AIA document that could have an evaluation component. And some of those exist for green building, but there's not a sense that they can be applied to social evaluation as well. In the questionnaire, I asked respondents, sorry about that, to select the scales of evaluation they were interested in. So from the room to the unit, and it was interesting. It was interesting to see how many were interested in neighborhood evaluation. So what is how do we evaluate how the neighborhood views the building? And this can be, a NIMBY issue, obviously, but it can also be a way to create greater context for the building. So one questionnaire respondent noted, to evaluate the building's design and inclusion in neighborhood or greater context is a priority for me. Is it a positive addition to the neighborhood? And though many cities require extensive neighborhood process at the beginning of the project for affordable housing, there's not really a loop for architects to receive neighborhood input after it is built. So a policy lever that could shift that culture would be to have a post-construction design review process that the architects could learn from for the next building. Many of the interviewees and questionnaire respondents noted that they didn't have a simple, effective means of reporting out, especially to other architects. And I have a suggestion for future knowledge community programs, such as quarter credit hour webinars, where a housing architect could report on a simple and completed evaluation of a recent building. We're all really prepared now because of the pandemic to make these kind of very short videos that are image heavy with narration. It would certainly, as an educator, I would be thrilled to have access to that kind of reporting from architects that my students could learn from. And the creator of the video could also receive continuing education credits just to do the evaluation and make the short video. So I think that this is a process I've been talking with the knowledge community about how we might be able to foster this kind of relationship. Lily Gray, one of my developer interviewees, suggested that the 3-year mark is actually the best time to evaluate a building socially, which is different than for green buildings, where we're interested in how they're performing at the year mark after 4 full seasons so that we can understand the performance aspects. Lily thought for social aspects, the building doesn't really break in until that 3rd year. Ray Demers also suggested in a separate interview an award for a 3-year-old project that included some sort of social evaluation in the award submission. And this would best serve the least experienced evaluators, such as not yet but soon, because they are already very much in the habit of submitting for awards and need an incentive really to do their first evaluations. And then finally, a more personal suggestion that has benefited me is the idea that architects and academics partnering on evaluations could help develop, help take advantage of the importance of evaluation for the architect in the next project and the importance of being able to access a building for academics. So creating a partnership that that lasts for the length of the project, including post-occupancy, that can foster this access but also create research questions that are very much tied to the building itself. So this is something that I've worked on personally. I have a current research collaboration with Amanda D'Onofrio in Eugene, Oregon. And Amanda brought me some questions about permanent supportive housing. And I just found some research, some previously created studies in the academic literature, and summarized them and sent them to her. And then she asked me some questions that weren't answerable in recent scholarship. And so I did a short empirical study that she then used to inform the building. What I'm most looking forward to, of course, is that eventually I will be able to access the buildings that she's designed through this research to test some of the social aspects. So I think if there is a mechanism by which we can connect interested academics and architects for housing evaluation, it can alleviate the barrier for the architect of time and energy and money, and it can alleviate the barrier for housing researchers in terms of access and really important, grounded research questions that actually matter to the profession. So the end goal of this type of partnership would be to report out, right? So to get the research to practitioners who can design with the new knowledge, and to academics who can then build on it. And I think it's a system that can be in place, and it relies on, I believe it relies on partnerships more than it relies on like the university setting itself. It's about an academic and architect coming together, forging this relationship, and seeing it through post-occupancy and evaluation. So I am grateful, as I've mentioned, to AIA's knowledge community, housing community design, knowledge community. I'm also very grateful to all the people who did interviews during the pandemic on Zoom, early days, I will say, of the pandemic in spring of 2020, and to them sharing their knowledge and being interested in this work and seeking to inspire those not yet but soon people who later answered and remain anonymous, but answered the questionnaire later in the summer. So I think with that, I'll finish, and I am very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Christina. Terrific presentation. A lot of different conceptual sort of sparks going off about aspects of this that are interesting to me anyway. I'll open it up to the floor again. If you raise your hands, if you want to speak, or just, we're a small enough group, just unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment for Christina. And I'm going to turn on my video too. Okay. Okay, well, I've got several. So I thought I'd maybe start off with some of mine and spark some ideas from other people. I love the idea of the blower door test for social. If we could ever, somebody on my staff, it seems like all she's ever doing is blower door tests. So if there was some aspect to that door that could open up social data collection, that would probably be an interesting patentable invention. But I wanted to ask, so in the feed forward parts of this and the expert versus the green, not versus, but differentiated from. You mentioned that for the energy side of things, which is in a lot of ways the green and energy, there's sort of engineering underpinned issues. So they have baselines that you can measure. And I know in POE back in the day when I used to be thinking about it, which is probably it's changed its name 6 times since then, but you had to look at the design intent was basically the same thing that you were evaluating against. And but what would be in current thinking for social, what would be the baseline and how would you determine it? What would, going in, if you were an evaluation between a partnership between an architecture firm and an academic institution, how would you establish what you're looking for, unless the vision of what an evaluation is I think you're saying has gone way beyond what it used to be. You're not really evaluating the performance of the building for the building. You're evaluating for the lessons you can learn going forward. And maybe that takes some of the design intent requirement out of it. But anyway, what would be the baseline, do you think, going in for a social into a building?
Well, I think there are several. I mean, one that I've studied in the past is turnover rate. So how often people move, how long people stay in an apartment, and what we can learn by comparing apartments in the same building. So vacancy. We can see a little bit too from turnover time, how long it takes to get someone to accept the apartment. And of course, in affordable housing, many people have very little housing choice, but they're still making choices that we can learn from through the evaluation of that type of data. I think sound transmission, I mentioned I was very surprised that 50% said they were measuring that. My guess is they are measuring it from a construction point of view. So they're testing sound transmission in a non-occupied condition to make sure the building has met the building code requirements around sound transmission, less than they're measuring it socially. So they're not necessarily taking into account an occupied building. They're not necessarily taking into account people's perception of sound between apartments, both up and down, which is of course much harder to control, and side by side. So I think there should be a baseline. We should create a baseline around sound transmission. I think we should say that people shouldn't be able to hear their neighbors. And that's not asking too much of our buildings to say, people, especially in affordable housing, often live in denser conditions than in the market. How do we mitigate some of that density through enhanced sound transmission? I mean, I don't need to go on too much about sound transmission, but I will say in the city of Seattle, staggered studs are required between condos, and in affordable housing, they're not. And I find that curious, and perhaps a social injustice that we're not taking. We absolutely know how to mitigate sound side by side. And if we're not doing that in affordable housing.
Yeah. Interesting. Other questions from folks? Again, if you can use the reactions and raise your hands, I'll recognize you, but otherwise feel free to unmute and ask a question. Okay. There's Kathy. Okay.
Hi, Christine.
Hey,
Yeah,
Kathy.
good to see you and hear you. And so many things came up from this presentation and other work you've done that are really thoughtful to me, causing me to think about my work and how we judge things, and also how we report back the stuff we know. So, I'll guarantee you if there's a sound transmission issue, it's been reported. It's just whether it's been reported back to the architect or the developer or others, but management knows. So, there's things like that where part of it is a collection issue, right? So we have the information, we just may not have it where we get to it. But I've also been thinking a little bit about what's the difference between evaluation and reflective practice. And I wonder if you could comment a little on that.
Yeah. I guess for me, the difference between those two things are the external inputs and outputs versus internal inputs and outputs. So in a reflective practice, when that goes very well in a firm of more than one person, for example, the design intent is compared to the design results, the built work, and that there's a reflective process that architects have in evaluating that internally to their person, but then that internal evaluation can also happen within the team or within the office. I would say evaluation takes in more external inputs. So usually there's a mechanism that's rigorous, and by rigorous, I mean everything is examined. So I don't know that I think reflective process needs to go into every single unit and see where the television is located as compared to where we chose to put the cable outlet. But I think an evaluation would. I think reflective practice could incorporate, for example, 2 cable outlets and be successful, right? Whereas an evaluation looks at what the residents are doing unit by unit by unit by unit, and then makes a kind of a finding, right? Comes up with a result from that. And then I would say reflective process isn't necessarily shared with other architects. I have many observations from the buildings I designed as an architect that I haven't shared with people because I'm still sort of trying to figure out what happened. And so it's not necessarily something I would share, but it's something that informs my future projects, especially in terms of the design process, I guess, more than product. And then I think evaluation, in order to be evaluation, it has to be reported out, whether that's to other architects or to the client or back to the residents. There has to be that process of dissemination. And I don't think that's true for reflective process. Is that, Kathy, is that getting at the, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really, really helpful and really thoughtful. And I think, part of it causes me to say that, all of us should be reporting out more of what we learn, right? Because we do learn a lot. I've also been thinking a lot about how much you learn doing rehab, right? Because you start and you see what's worked, from construction details to, when you're starting the process with a new project, you are interviewing people. We map where furniture is and things like that. And again, we don't usually report that out, but I was going through a building with an owner who's building something new, and they were running the hardwood in the kitchen, wall to wall, not just, up to the cabinets. And that's clearly somebody who's done a lot of rehab. They know to do that. And, it certainly causes me to think we should all be reporting out what we learn when we look at before as well as what we after.
Yeah. Another thing is, I'm sorry, the reflective practice is in a way the research question that then we can evaluate. So I had a project, an early lead for homes project, and I visited a year and a half later after it was completed, and there was something weird about the light in one of the units when I was walking through, and I realized that there was a roof penetration, and that the resident on the top floor had created a skylight essentially in his unit. And we had some issues there with construction issues after that for fixing the roof, but I thought, well, that's interesting. I mean, it's not, what was it about the light that wasn't sufficient that he would go to those lengths? Or what about the ventilation wasn't sufficient that he would go to those lengths? So that's a research question, right? But I hope that doesn't, I don't know. It's a funny example, but that's one of those where that wouldn't be an evaluation to see that, but it certainly could spur me to do a survey of those residents and say, how are you too warm or too cold? That kind of thing. Do you have enough light? Those kind of questions to understand if it's an anomalous issue or if it's common to the whole building.
Yeah, in terms of what you're both saying, Kathy, going back to the old days of the design advisor, that was one of the goals that we had for that tool, was that it would be a platform for people talking to each other and sharing what worked and what didn't. Particularly, we were looking at materials and methods, but there were design components to it too. And there's two elements or levels of that to me, because we used to have a woman working for us who had worked at Gensler. And she said, as a matter of course, every single building or interior that they did, they went back on some pretext, several of the architects or interior designers, and they would walk through the thing and look around, but they were doing a POE light, even though it sounded like to the client, they were just everything okay, blah, blah. They had a structure to what they were doing. And, can't say Gensler isn't working for itself. I mean, it's sort of built into that culture. And I just heard a talk by Perkins and Will about evidence-based design. They were looking at it more at the front end, like pre-programming, rather than talking about the POE to feed forward. But within those constructs, is there a business here? And where people could, I don't know who would pay for it, but I've always thought, I mean, I know guys back when I was at the AIA, people up in Canada did have a business doing this. It was more like real estate assessment, but it was a way they did POEs to inform how to inform facilities people to design or operate better. And, but I don't think it's scaled. And I don't know if maybe it could now, maybe you could comment on that. Is there like a new mini profession that could emerge out of this?
I mean, I became an academic in part because I don't do monetizing things. So I don't think I'm the best person to think about the entrepreneurial model.
Anybody in the network want to pick this up
right.
and start a business? Feel free to mention something. But I did, further to that, I did want to talk about scalability. There's the evaluation and the 4 different types of evaluators for an existing building or for a recently designed or 3-year-old building that you could go into on the social side anyway, and look at these, and you can get sort of qualitative and quantitative information out of that. But is there a way that this could scale? So you start looking at large data sets of floor plans, of multiple images of things where I don't know what that would be, but can it scale up so you're taking use of big data and big data analytics to come up with some different findings, but things that are more maybe broadly applicable?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's especially, I mean, I see, unlike the entrepreneurial model, I see a lot of potential for that with housing researchers. I mean, we are desperate for this kind of data because it doesn't really exist yet. And if you're interested in studying how people use buildings, and you're an academic, the data is essential. So I wonder if there's a kind of a consortium approach, or it's something that the knowledge community creates, where there's a sharing of that information. And then someone who has the bandwidth and time, such as a researcher in a university, can evaluate that, right, and use those skills to evaluate that. I don't know. What I focused on more was encouraging firms, well, so thinking about the expert, encouraging the expert to do multiple buildings and to scale it in that direction within the firm or within a client. Okay. I haven't thought much about how it can scale more laterally across firms. So I think there's a lot of potential there.
Cool. Susan has a question, and then Seema.
So funny enough, Seema, I was going to put you on the spot a bit and ask, so Seema, we're fortunate enough to have Seema from CHFA. And I was going to ask if CHFA has considered requiring POEs, or do they do them separately that we just never know about? Or and because I could see how probably you've been doing them informally forever, and that it informs your standards or your guidelines. So that's my question.
Well, thank you, Susan. I was almost about to hit the same question, and to address some of what you asked, I think as part of this QAP, we are asking for some kind of assessments. We are asking for, for the tenants to be, given a brief overview of their building, so they know how to use these, sustainable, highly efficient buildings that we are creating, because sometimes they don't just know it. They don't know how to operate the windows. I mean, they're very, I was on the site, last month. And I mean, even for me, we were trying to figure out, all right, how to open up the windows, because, they were European windows and they don't operate in just the same manner as an American window would operate. And I was hearing that even the residents don't know how to operate some of that. Besides that, I was thinking, and I think what Christina mentioned just triggered another idea. For our buildings, our asset managers do visit the sites. And I thought if we were to give them like a brief overview of what we would want them to look at and report out, that would inform us. I mean, I do hear about issues when they can't operate their, HVAC systems, or their, their boilers are not working, or, something is not working. I do hear, or if there's a condensation issue, we hear, but not everything gets to us. But if we create a system where at least we are in the loop, then we'd be able to, maybe I have an opportunity to discuss it with all of you on these monthly meetings. Oh, this is what we heard. So it's, it's a loop that we are creating. Something along those lines was where I was thinking about it.
I have a comment on that too, but Kathy, I think might want to add something to that. Kathy, your hand's up.
Yeah, go ahead, Dean, first, and I'll follow up.
No, I was going to ask, we're doing this round robin. Susan was going to ask Seema. Dean is going to ask Kathy. But what I want to sort of bring up is that doing something for asset managers in public housing and HUD finance housing, that sounds like a proposal to HUD to fund something like that to me. Why don't we do that? Do a training on asset managers on the whole management side of it, but how to actually do a more structured evaluation of the facilities that they're operating. But I don't know if that's the way you were thinking, Kathy, but I was going to ask you, what do you think?
Well, I think it's a great research topic, and it certainly is the kind of thing the current administration federally is looking at. So I think that's a great idea. Community Builders has an internal evaluation program, and it's not so much a social evaluation of how the housing performs for the residents, which of course is the most important question, but it's about how materials choices work. And so they do, they study different materials choices they've made and how long things last and what the, effective life cycle cost of different materials is. And they've really moved based on that internal evaluation, their materials choices. I've heard them talk about it, but they have, I haven't been able to get them to share that, that material. And I suspect other developers do a similar thing where there is information out there. I had a conversation a number of years ago with Leslie Adler, who was then the architect at the New York Division of Housing and Community Renewal. Now it's Housing and Community Renewal. And they were starting the process of taking all the data that they administer, the housing tax credits in New York, as well as other things that they collect, and doing some evaluation. And they were going to be looking at maintenance costs and occupancy and other issues, and use them to reflect back on other choices. And she was unfortunately in the process of designing that study when she got quite ill, and was not able to ever return to work. But she had thought quite a bit about it, and I don't know if any of the folks there, still would have any of that information. But she was, New York has a lot of information.
Let's see. Any other? We're getting near time. I had one last question or comment about the types of evaluators and how we all probably have all four of them in us somewhere. But do you foresee the potential for there being, both synergies and conflicts between the green side of things and the social side of things? Have you seen it in the field, or does the green inhibit good social? Does social inhibit good green? Or that's not really asking the right question.
No, I hear what you're saying. I think, there's a lot of that is just framing. I've read a lot of studies about rehab, energy retrofits of buildings, and reuptake of temperature, for example. So we do all this work to renovate old buildings and make them more insulated. And then there's not the energy benefit that we're expecting. And it's partly because now that the bills are lower, residents are turning up the thermostat, for example. So I think that that's not necessarily a conflict, right? If we're thinking about resident comfort, but it is, there are intersections, I would say, more than conflict between those two areas. Given my background, both have always been very important to me, so I don't really see it as being in conflict. But I think maybe for some people it would. If I could just say something about what Seema's talking about, one aspect of evaluating or when a HFA of any kind goes out to the field to check on buildings, I've been really curious. Your neighbor, Massachusetts, has some of the most prescriptive unit size and unit layout requirements in the whole nation. And I've been really curious if they're doing post-occupancy evaluation of those units, because they could be repeating a bad idea over and over and over again. There's some danger in that. And I'm curious whether or not those kind of prescriptive requirements can be tested in the field by HFAs, like the role of the HFA to say, okay, we put this in our QAP that all units have to be this size, for example, and have this many windows. Is it working, right? Before we replicate that through every single tax credit finance project, is it working? So that might be a HFA contribution.
Okay, so whatever just happened sparked a lot of interest. So we've got some more questions going here. I don't know who came in first, but Peter Ludwig, why don't you're at the top of the list here. So you, and then Susan again, and then Steve Hall.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I should have had I guess more of a comment about this discussion about training. And I think that I've seen a lot of this kind of O&M training and tenant training and engagement work well. And someone mentioned like, oh, that could be a grant to HUD. And I feel like about 10 years ago, I was working in Chicago, and we did a lot of work with some of the CDCs there, like groups that, like there's one called Bickerdike and one called Hispanic Housing that do a lot of really great affordable housing. And I think where they were most successful was when the residents of the building were engaged sort of before the retrofit occurred, because I think the retrofit of a building is very abstract, and training residents to understand how to use a system it's not a terribly useful exercise in my experience. Even I've heard training O&M people is sometimes not a terribly useful experience if there's no context. So what I did see people like Bickerdike and Hispanic Housing do was try to create more space for the tenants in the building to kind of create their own culture and meaning around what the new building meant, right? Like what was sort of important to them about the systems or the comfort level or the operability of the spaces they lived in. So I just wanted to throw that out there as, and I mean, those groups are still around, so you can call them up and ask them how they did it and what worked and what didn't work. And thank you for the space.
Great, thank you, Peter. Next, Susan had another question or comment. Susan?
Hi, Peter. Just I'm getting so much information here, I can't keep it straight in my head. Well, Christina, I want to thank you so much for your presentation, and I've had the pleasure of seeing you present a few times now, and every time I just learn many more things. One thing that occurred to me is, so you, the way you approached your research was to look at the firms that have won housing design awards. And so what I just learned through attending the fall forum of the knowledge community was those firms tend to be bigger and have more resources to put together very nice packages of, for awards. And so I would imagine that's the exact same thing that happens. They're bigger, they have more resources to do the POEs and devote more staff to it. Is there any hope for the small firm? Were you able to reach any small firms that were doing this, or are they still all in that group of we would like to someday maybe?
I talked to Kitty Ryan and in Massachusetts, and I would say she has the smallest firm. I think there are 4 of them. And I did look for small firms who had won awards. So just a little background, I didn't talk much about the method of this research, but I started by looking at who had won housing awards so that I could ensure that they had the capacity for something like this for the interviews, whereas the questionnaire was much bigger. And I would say more, the firms represented in the questionnaire were more likely to be over 50 or under 5, whereas the firms represented by the interviews are more in the like 30-person range. So in terms of, except for Kitty and the Narrow Gate, her firm. And I would say, Kitty, I actually met her later through a partnership with a professor at Notre Dame. She had gone to Notre Dame and she had reached out to them to see if a student group could evaluate one of her recent buildings so that she could then inform the next building. The students interviewed groups of women who lived in the building. It's a women's only building, and to understand how they use the space. So I do think that the potential for small architects in those one-on-one part, or small firms rather, in the one-on-one partnership is higher. And that may be a place of potential. And if there's a consortium, I think that's another way to make small firms have bigger scope for this.
Yeah, I was thinking the faculty idea and the connection might work well at that smaller firm level. Steve Hall, did you?
Yeah, just a quick question in and around you mentioned energy, and what comments did you get back about energy? I'm just curious.
I would say every single one of the interview, is this true? Almost all of the people I interviewed mentioned having access to energy bills on a unit by unit basis. This worked best in all electric buildings than it did in buildings that relied on gas-fired boilers, for example, for hot water radiators. But it enabled people to understand how energy was being used by the residents, what times of day, for example, was something that they brought up. And I think someone at Letty Madam Stacy said they were really interested in the difference in energy between the two sides of the building. So that was something that they had wanted to investigate. So the north side, it was a double loaded corridor with north facing and south facing units. What was the difference, right? And that tells, I mean, that to me is an intersection of three things. It's design, of course, and the decisions we make to maximize the number of units. It's energy use. And then it's the social piece too, right? How people are occupying that space. You can tell when people are coming home even, right? By when they turn on the heat, how cold they are. So I think energy use has, especially when it's unit by unit, has a huge social component, and we can learn a lot in a non-invasive way. Privacy issues aside, it's a non-invasive approach to understanding how people are using their apartments.
So the thrust from what you're saying would seem to be isolating energy use by unit, correct?
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm a big fan of submetering, even water. I mean, I think it helps us to understand where there are problems with the building, technical problems with the building, such as leaks, but also with how people are using energy and water in particular.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's it. Peter, your hand's still up. Did you want to say one more thing, Peter Ludwig? Okay.
No,
All right,
sorry.
well then, okay, I'll mention one thing in closing out this part of the session, but this talk of continuous improvement, or how do we learn from what we're doing. Several years ago, I saw an exhibit. It was a permanent installation. I can't remember exactly where I was, but I could look it up. But it tracked a program in either a jurisdiction near Zurich or somewhere in Switzerland, where for like almost 30 years, the housing agency that was the people that were involved in housing there put up projects and studied the hell out of them, and then did new projects based on what they learned. And they just continually did it. They have, I think it's at least 20, it might be a 30-year record of lessons learned imported into new projects, lessons learned from those projects, and it was just fascinating. I was thinking, how could we do that here? It's like, why aren't we? But anyway, on that note, that's for the future. I'd like to thank Christina for a really great presentation. Like Kathy was saying, a lot of stuff is buzzing around in my head. What we're going to do, and everybody, raise your hands and clap if you can. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
And then for the P2P group who's on, we're going to just do a normal. We haven't done it in a long time. I'm sorry, Christina, did you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. And then I guess I'll leave. It's always awkward to leave a Zoom meeting. So thank you for having me.
And you're welcome to stay. We're just going to go around and talk about what each of us is doing if you want to listen.
Oh, okay. No, I would love to listen in. That's okay. Sure. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, so I think we'll do that, sort of the usual, what's everybody up to, although I see people are beginning to drop off, and mention a couple of things. The speaker next month, we're going to have Emma Raymond from McGran is going to be talking about passive house and high performance mechanical systems. And that's set up for the 19th. You'll all be getting an invite to that, but that's coming. And then we'll probably be off in December, and then we'll set up a new slate for January and for the next 6 months with the group that's been trying to pull the speakers together. And so that's a good thing. Hopefully we'll get a in-person or hybrid meeting going sometime in the not too distant future. We hope. In addition, Vicky has put together a list of all the presentations that we've had given since almost the beginning of this effort. And it's really quite impressive what we've covered, who's spoken, what the topics were. We have a little bit of unevenness in terms of what was recorded and what wasn't. But Vicky, how many presentations does it come to on the spreadsheet?
Give me one moment. We have with Christina's today, we have 24.
24. So we'll send those out, and because we maybe be looking for feedback on, okay, so how does this represents a body of knowledge that the P2P network has put together. Maybe there's some things we can do with it. Not necessarily to monetize it, Christina, but to do something that, is, enhances the reputation of the network or whatever. So anyway, we just assembled that, and, it's like whenever you have something that's sort of been sitting somewhere and you look at it for the first time in its totality, it sort of sparks some ideas of things to do. And then the third thing I wanted to mention to everybody, I had a brain cramp last week that I thought, and it actually might tie into what Christina and some of you were talking about today, that maybe we should do a version of these nano credits you were talking about, Christina, which have been beaten on AIA for 15 years now to do that, and they're finally doing it. Mostly through my work with Arc Record, but they allow you to get 15-minute credits. And I thought it would be interesting to do project showcases from all of you. Take a project, do it like you were saying, a highly visual unwrapping of it, and highlight the key points and anything about how it's working, and afterwards be great, because all of you are working and have worked on really good projects. And I think it's time that we start telling the world about them. So more to come on that. We'll talk that through a little bit later, but maybe we're down to a core group now, so we can talk about what we've done and what's top of mind for what you're doing out there. Start with you, Kathy, and then we'll work through the rest of the group.
Sorry, it takes me, I'm a slow unmuter. So an exciting new thing I'm working with LISC on a project they have to help with strategic planning for 3 community development groups in Hartford. So we're looking at really thinking about how the community development corporations and organizations help really advance their communities. And so I've always thought that one of the things that Connecticut doesn't do as much as other states I work in is to support community development, which is different than housing. We do a really good job on housing, I think, in many ways. So I'm excited about that intervention. And I'm also excited about some thinking on the state level, particularly at DEEP, about what they're calling justice communities and how we publicly intervene in them. So those are my exciting new things.
Great. That sounds like a great project. Paul, how about you? Paul Solnow.
There I am. Yeah, so I've actually been pretty busy, but I'll talk about 2 things in particular. One will kind of piggyback on what was being discussed earlier about Massachusetts and their DHCD requirement in their stringent unit sizes, because I've got a project under construction right now, which is funded by them about a year ago, and it's about 60% through construction, and we're going to have occupancy sometime in the spring. So I'm very close with this client, so I know I can get some data, so I'll see what I can find out about that. But the big thing I've been working on is from last year, we got selected to do an LIGTC project in New Haven. It's a mass timber passive house project. And so I've been very, very busy completing that, getting pricing, and it's been submitted to FIAS, and I'm in my review comments, and I'm finishing up the final few at this point. So
Great.
that's really moving along, and I'd be glad to share that as we move forward, because there's some different things about that.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, with CLT, there's two buildings, a bigger one and a smaller one, so you can see the problems, the smaller one versus the bigger one, and this and that. So I'd be glad to share that at some point, Dean, like you were talking about. I know we
Cool.
discussed
Okay.
that before.
How about you, Steve Hall? How about you? What's new in your world?
In my world, unfortunately, I had a very large project at 400,000 square foot that I was going to insert into a new NYSERDA program on community heat pumps. But the client got a little cold feet about it. He thought it was premature to do that. I didn't think so, but he did. So there it goes. So I think it was you who called me the energy concierge. And that has stuck a bit. And so I'm looking, if anybody sees any opportunities for energy concierge work, I'm happy to do it. One thing I am working on with a unique firm that does packages energy efficiency measures is to, and I've talked about it in the press release that you may have seen, is I think we need to restructure how we put projects together in terms of stack financing and lifting large amounts of capital out off the books, if you will, for the time being. So it's kind of a model I'm working with, and I think it may have a great impact on affordable housing, but more to report down the road on that.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Peter, how about you?
Oh, yeah. Hi. I'm not sure I know everyone. So I'm Peter. I work at the Connecticut Green Bank, and my main role is working on helping commercial buildings of all kinds, but also affordable housing, work with our CPACE program, which provides long-term financing for energy saving measures, both for existing buildings and new construction. And some of the new things that are happening at the Green Bank are PURA, the state regulator, rolled out, and we're partnering with utilities on a new battery storage incentive program.
Cool.
And there's more to come on that, but there will be a focus on kind of underserved community, critical facilities, and affordable housing with some enhanced incentives. And we're also keeping an eye on the new solar tariff program that's rolling out next year, which will have, under which home and building owners can receive long-term fixed payments for their solar arrays. It will also potentially, it will change the way affordable housing tariffs are treated. They'll be treated as residential instead of commercial, which is good because there will be more money and they won't run out. So we're still trying to see sort of how that will play out, but we hope that that will be really advantageous for affordable housing owners who want to do power purchase agreements and other things like that.
Cool. Okay. Okay. And then Seema?
Yeah, so we just rolled out the new QAP, and the QAP overview session was last week. I hope you all got a chance to attend it. We are presenting again on, I think, the 17th. It would be an abridged version, but we're trying to reach out as many folks as we can. On our projects, we are seeing cost increases across the board for all our projects because of supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, and we're trying to help out and find funds to fill in the gaps because most of our projects have gaps right now. So
Yeah, well,
that's the big thing that every day is doing that.
well, good luck with that. Good luck from all of us on that issue. All right, and from my perspective, just something that's new in my world, although you've heard me talk about it a bazillion times, we've had this focus within our center for at least a decade on what we call opportunistic retrofitting, which is trying to layer in energy improvements whenever you're doing a remodeling job, in particular re-roofing, re-siding, new windows, the big ones, the envelope ones that last a long time. And the statistic we always quote is there's 10,000 re-siding jobs done every single year in New Jersey, and 9,998 are not optimized for energy performance, and the 2 that are part of projects we're working on. And so it's not scaling, but it should, because the delta for the energy upgrade is so much less than it is for an energy upgrade you're doing just for energy purposes. You're already doing it. The homeowner's already decided to spend 10 grand on a re-siding job. The delta is 750. It's not a lot of money. So we're trying to pursue that. But the good news about all of that is we've been beating on the Department of Energy store for at least 8 years about this. And they have not, they've been paying lip service to existing buildings forever. And we've been saying, where do you think the problem is? It's not, there's no excuse for it being in new construction. It's in existing buildings. And so they're finally they seem to have, the Kool-Aid has started to cook. It's not been drunk yet, but they're sort of getting it. They seem to be putting out RFPs about that. And it seems to be percolating. Ed Mazria came out with something about it. So the good news is maybe there's going to be some more action on that front at the national, particularly within the infrastructure bill. We put together an op-ed that hasn't actually been published yet, but we looked at existing retrofits, remodels, commercial and residential. $500 million? No, more than that, $500 billion a year. It's private sector infrastructure development in this country that in 3 years outstrips the infrastructure bill. And it's happening every day. And it's an energy opportunity that's cheap, relatively. So we're trying to put it in the context of, look, we're talking about this is private sector infrastructure building. It's not even public sector. And it's a huge business. So that was an aha to us about how we frame this. But so far, there hasn't been much action, but there seems to be more attention. So more to come on that in future meetings. And with that, I think, I think Christina has gone. So thank you all for coming. Watch your email boxes for the announcement for next year's. Hello, Christina. For next month's, and Christina, you're now on the list, so you're more than welcome to join in on our meetings if the topic is of interest. And more to come on this project showcase idea, and also the list of presentations that we've amalgamated now, and maybe have a discussion about, okay, what does that mean for the network going forward, maybe into 2022. And unless there's any other questions or comments, thank you all for coming. And if you're where I am, you're going to have a great weekend. At least weather-wise. So enjoy it, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.